Minon ora kyllä certum, sed morse certa facit. Let those weak minds who live in doubt and fear, to juggling priests for oracles repair. One certain hour of death to each decreed, my fixed, my certain soul from doubt has freed. Hello everyone. Today we are going to talk about Samuel Johnson as Samuel Johnson. What do I mean by that? We are going to see today in play why this thinker is considered the doctor of the self. Up until now, in the previous videos, we have been learning from him about how to manage life in this world filled with its fill of challenges. We have been trying to figure out how to correct the rich or how the poor contribute to the richness of the rich or why Ertugrul was never happy. We have realized by now, hopefully, that Johnson was a polymath, a writer who wrote on everything and who knew the fundamental conditions of human so well so that we hardly need to read any other writer except for him to figure out what is a good life. His wit is unchallenged in the literary world and his writing style more so. Today we are going to look at him again as a philosopher. Primarily, we need to disabuse ourselves of a few prejudices attached with philosophy or philosopher. When we think of anyone as a philosopher, we consider him or her to be a person whose task is simply to make things incomprehensible. We feel a certain hammer hitting on our heads, weighing us down at the mention of Kant, Descartes, Hegel, or Heidegger. Why so? We come equipped with the wrong attitude to a philosophy treatise usually. We know that as soon as we will open the book, our heads will be filled with lengthy debates about metaphysics and ontology. But the main armor every layman has against philosophy is that it is impractical. Having forgotten the fact that even as difficult a thinker as Kant said that the most pertinent use of reason is practical. It is in practical daily life that we see philosophy played out and its rules derived. But it is certain that academic philosophy has dried out the soul of philosophy. I should add that we cannot include every academician in it. But by and large, the people whom we call professional philosophers, i.e., those who have a degree in philosophy, seem to be a bane on our environment. They write lugubrious texts that are read by, on average, 1.2 people, and those who do not read them lead a better life than those who read them. Now you might be thinking, how is that a bane on our environment? It is not just our minds who are victims of these useless philosophical texts, but also the trees that provide paper for these books. Okay, jokes apart. We need to have some standard to decide what is philosophy exactly. What should we consider its principal task? For this, we need to refer to Montaigne, who thankfully is not considered a thinker worthy to be studied by these academic philosophers. He said that the chief task of philosophy is to teach us how to die. And this is precisely what Johnson's essay is about. We have seen him teach us how to live. He may have given us some advices regarding our spending patterns, but today we are going to see perhaps his ultimate advice that even he would have given to himself. That is to say, how to live a life where dying rules. It might seem pessimistic at first, but as soon as the essay will begin, we will know that there is no teacher like death in this world, which does not suck away our joys and keep us mulling over our sad days. On the contrary, We will see how Johnson will argue that the most unfortunate man is the one who does not know how to die. So why wait? Let's see the dance of the self in front of its own death. Johnson begins thus his essay number 17 in The Idler. Quote open. It is recorded of some Eastern monarch that he kept an officer in his house whose employment it was to remind him of his mortality by calling out every morning at a stated hour, "Remember, prince, that thou shalt die." And the contemplation of the frailness and uncertainty of her present state appeared of so much importance to Solon of Athens that he left this precept to future ages. Keep thine eye fixed upon the end of life. Quote close. Rarely do we see the mention of philosophers or sages in the beginning of Johnson's essays. Usually, he presents a problem first of all with some introductory remarks and then dive into the details. But here the subject is too well known that he does not have a word to say about it. It is death. Who does not know death? Who has not seen a human being breathing his last, just somehow trying to grasp life, while his soul has had enough of this depreciating body? And it is not just a commoner, a poor, a middle class, or an elite class person. There is no either or here. It is not that somehow money would convince the soul to stay in this prison of mortal desires, nor is it that poverty would have some mercy on the poor old father who has yet to take care of his young infants. Death has no religion, death has no race, death has no economic class. It comes unannounced democratically, democratic in the true sense of the word, to everyone. The Idler was not a newspaper that the rich read. Most of the readers of The Idler were the working class people. Imagine for yourself one morning you would have woken up in the 18th century after a good night's sleep, forced by hard labor, and searching for The Idler on the door, would have read the first line of this essay. You would have felt, I assume, the consolation of having read a truth that would have subsided immediately your anger against the elite class or the king, because they may show off as much haughtiness as they can. One day they will also be in grave like us. The only difference is that you would have expected them to know it. Just as now we would expect every minister of our country to have such an officer in his or her house. Solon is one amongst the seven sages of ancient Greeks. He was the father of Athens as we came to know it. He was considered the most respected sage of his time. Since we are on Solon, we should not leave him without telling a tale that represents his personality and wisdom, known to almost everyone. The tale goes thus. Solon had recently completed his reforms in Athens and visited Croesus at his Sardis palace. Despite his wealth, Solon was unimpressed by Croesus's accomplishments, and Croesus asked him who he thought was the happiest man on the planet. Solon explained that Thales the Athenian was neither wealthy nor impoverished, and his children were honorable and good. Now, Croesus was a bit taken aback. So, if he doesn't get number one, let's see if I can get number two. Croesus asked Solon who he believed would come next, and Solon responded that Aglaus was the one who never left his property and passed away. Now, after listening at Aglaus's name, obviously now only one position is left, which is the third one. So he asked him again, who would occupy the third place? He then mentioned Biton and Cleobis, who were actually the son of Cydippe, a priestess, who died peacefully while sleeping in the temple of Hera. Croesus was confused by Solon's comments as he believed that man was completely at random and no one could predict what the gods would bring in the future. As a result, the king dismissed Solon without considering him, believing him to be either a great fool or a worse liar. It is his advice that Johnson repeats to himself and to us: keep thine eye fixed upon the end of life. This is more of a diary entry for Johnson rather than a public essay. He continues, quote open, a frequent and attentive prospect of that moment which must put a period to all our schemes and deprive us of all our acquisitions is indeed of the utmost efficacy to the just and rational regulation of our lives. Nor would ever anything wicked, or often anything absurd, be undertaken or prosecuted by him who should begin every day with a serious reflection that he is born to die. Quote close. Human mind is absurd. Knowing that it is mortal, it continues to create plans as if it is immortal. Or, as Johnson explains, that the better way to understand this condition is that it forgets about its own mortality. But is not that weird? If we are sick with fever, can it ever happen that we forget that we are sick? Then how come we forget this malady? The malady that ends all maladies. And that is precisely the problem. We are not wise according to Johnson. It is sheer stupidity to consider death as a malady. It is not a malady, it is actually a remedy. Our minds are short sighted and have a limited space to cram up different ideas and perceptions. We often forget because we are always hopping from one thing to the other, getting distracted at every moment, gathering thoughts here and there after looking at frivolous things or people. And let alone death, we sometimes even forget to do simple things. And usually we all have a list of things pending at night that we could easily have done throughout the day had we only remembered, especially had we only remembered death. Johnson explains the obstructions in the human psyche that keep this remedy at bay. Quote open. The disturbers of our happiness in this world are our desires, our griefs, and our fears. And to all these, the consideration of mortality is a certain and adequate remedy. Think, says Epictetus, frequently on poverty, banishment, and death. And thou wilt then never indulge violent desires or give up thy heart to mean sentiments. Udene udopote tapinon intimacy, ute agan epitemisis tinos. Quote close. Our days begin with desires, griefs, and fears, and by the end of the day, we have more of them piled up than the day before. It is in the nature of violent desire that it takes long to get satisfied because it requires a lot of time, effort, and money. For example, if you want to buy a house, it takes years and a hell lot of economizing behavior to achieve this desire. Over here, we are not talking about natural desires like sleeping, eating, or drinking. Here we are talking about artificial desires. Natural desires never make us forget our mortality. In fact, they enforce it. As Johnson cites Epictetus in this regard, we can eat well, drink well, and sleep well without ever losing sight of our mortality. Because these natural desires do not occupy the mind like artificial desires do. And furthermore, the former are easy to satisfy, with nature providing us enough means to satisfy them everywhere. The problem of desires really becomes a problem when we have desires whose satisfaction is spread upon a long term. It is in getting them satisfied our minds forget their mortal span because we are constantly busy thinking about them. It is as simple as that. But it does highlight an important psychological attribute. Our minds are always on the lookout for desires, griefs, and fears. We seek more of them to run away from our mortality. Aristotle said that animal kingdom wants to have children because they want to partake in the immortality of nature. They want to extend their selves materially so that they somehow continue to live in the form of their children, or at least their ideas. We deliberately run away from mortality and dupe ourselves with violent desires into becoming immortals. I have done my fill of trying to explain this foundational principle of human psyche. Now stamp it with the words of the sage himself. Johnson writes, quote open, that the maxim of Epictetus is founded on just observation will easily be granted when we reflect how that vehemence of eagerness after the common objects of pursuit is kindled in our minds. We represent to ourselves the pleasures of some future possession and suffer our thoughts to dwell attentively upon it, till it has wholly engrossed the imagination and permits us not to conceive any happiness but its attainment, or any misery but its loss. Every other satisfaction which the bounty of Providence has scattered over life is neglected as inconsiderable in comparison of that great object which we have placed before us and is thrown from us as encumbering our activity or trampled underfoot as standing in our way. Quote close. A human being gets distracted very easily, and not just that. We also have the tendency to not just get distracted but stay distracted until we find some other distraction after having failed in achieving anything in our pursuit of previous distraction. We see this every day. We decide to become a pilot one day and inquire about the studies required to become one. And then, after having tired ourselves of the effort required, we change our preferences and want to become a stockbroker now, perhaps. It is startling how many times we engross ourselves in future projects like our lives depend upon them. But as soon as we are convinced that we are attracted by a new prospect that takes our minds by surprise, offering some new desires, more earning perhaps, and the spiral of desire and satisfaction continues. And just as we are happily sleepwalking into this world of desires, griefs, and fears, one day we are struck by nature to provide us some respite from this malady, as Johnson claims. Quote open. Every man has experienced how much of this ardor has been remitted when a sharp or tedious sickness has set death before his eyes. The extensive influence of greatness, the glitter of wealth, the praises of admirers, the attendance of supplicants have appeared vain and empty things when the last hours seem to be approaching. And the same appearance they would always have if the same thought was always predominant. We should then find the absurdity of stretching out our arms incessantly to grasp that which we cannot keep, and wearing out our lives in endeavors to add new turrets to the fabric of ambition when the foundation itself is shaking and the ground on which it stands is mouldering away. Quote close. Sickness is not a malady. It is a blessing sent by the angel of death that reminds us of the futility of our stupid appetites. A high fever is enough to convince us that all our plans will come to naught one day. And just yesterday, we were up and running, meeting with our friends and business partners and concocting projects and whatnot. But on this sick bed, we are astonished how frail is this body made of decomposing mud. We all run away from getting sick, and we should, by the way. But illness comes mostly unannounced to us. We are suddenly stupefied by the impotency of our body. And that is the important realization that we must gather when we get sick. No matter how grand we inflate ourselves with false promises, ultimately it is this same weak body that houses the soul. And stretch the thought a bit further to remember in these moments that it is this same weak body that will be no more one day. Our desires, griefs, and fears are metaphysical in nature, essentially speaking, because they belong to a different world than the material world. They are linked with the material world and come and go according to the material world. In fact, one must say that they are regulated by the material world, but their sensation is immaterial in our minds. We feel them surely, but it is not the same as touching a book or listening to a podcast. On the contrary, all desires are generated within us, even though motivated by the exterior world. Therefore, the source of desires gets a reality check when our bodies are shaken by the attack of disease. And the worst desire of all, envy, is the mother of all evil. In fact, this desire is the source of most of our superficial desires because it is purely generated by the other. And that's precisely what Johnson addresses next. Quote open. All envy is proportionate to desire. We are uneasy at the attainments of another according as we think our own happiness would be advanced by the addition of that which he withholds from us. And therefore, whatever depresses immoderate wishes will at the same time set the heart free from the corrosion of envy and exempt us from that vice which is above most others, tormenting to ourselves, hateful to the world, and productive of mean artifices and sordid projects. He that considers how soon he must close his life will find nothing of so much importance as to close it well, and will therefore look with indifference upon whatever is useless to that purpose. Whoever reflects frequently upon the uncertainty of his own duration will find out that the state of others is not more permanent, and that what can confer nothing on himself very desirable cannot so much improve the condition of a rival as to make him such superior to those from whom he has carried the prize. A prize too mean to deserve a very obstinate opposition. Quote close. Envy is the primary desire that turns our gaze towards people with the purpose of attaining the possessions of that person while wishing their destruction. It is such an evil desire that it wants to possess all while excluding all. It is immortality desired in simplest terms, where only I would rule and possess, and there would be no one as great as me who can share it. What else is the meaning of immortality if not pure envy? It is the seed of conflict and progenitor of a set of vicious thoughts that aim at nothing but at stealing others' possessions. It is different from ambition. Ambition always rewards with its fill of material prosperity if pursued with perseverance. It does not look left or right. The fire within is glorious and magnanimous enough that an ambitious person never feels the need to convince anyone of its worth. But envy is negative ambition. It comes from the outside and inseminates us with all kinds of crafty future projects filled with nothing but ill will towards others. Death should warn us against it. It is only if the angel of death appears in front of the envious person, then he would be convinced that contrary to his desire of others' annihilation, it is him who is about to be annihilated. It should be kept in mind that death is democratic in nature, purely democratic. It teaches the virtuous as much as it teaches the vicious, as Johnson continues. Quote open. Even grief, that passion to which the virtuous and tender mind is particularly subject, will be obviated and alleviated by the same thoughts. It will be obviated if all the blessings of our condition are enjoyed with a constant sense of this uncertain tenure. If we remember that whatever we possess is to be in our hands but a very little time, and the little which our most lively hopes and can promise us may be made less by 10,000 accidents, we shall not much repine at a loss, of which we cannot estimate the value, but of which, though we are not able to tell the least amount, we know with sufficient certainty the greatest, and are convinced that the greatest is not much to be regretted. Quote close. He wants to remind us about the biggest lesson, that the sensation of greatness or miserableness is as long as the moment itself. When we feel happiness or pleasure, we become acquainted with the possibility that we can have it again or somehow elongate it. Johnson attacks this assumption and clarifies that death is not just a ruler over humans, it is also a ruler over everything non-human, and that also includes our sentiments. Just as our body lives here hardly for as long as a blink of an eye, our sentiments are subjected to an even shorter life. Death is not a human specific phenomenon. It is the rule of the world, animate or inanimate, physical or metaphysical. Death is the ultimate ruler, and we all need to accept it and bow before it. Yes, we feel that we have lost something, but this feeling of loss will also be lost soon. Johnson further explains. Quote open. But if any passion has so much usurped our understanding as not to suffer us to enjoy advantages with the moderation prescribed by reason, it is not too late to apply this remedy when we find ourselves sinking under sorrow and inclined to pine for that which is irrecoverably vanished. We may then usefully revolve the uncertainty of our own condition and the folly of lamenting that from which, if it had stayed a little longer, we should ourselves have been taken away. Quote close. We always consider ourselves to outlast our possessions, and that is exactly the reason why we decide to possess them. We may outlast some of them, but it is certain that most of them will outlast us. We need to readjust our understanding of possessions, and for that, we need to readjust our expectations from them. If they are bringing any good to us or to the community at large, whether in the long term or the short, then even if they outlive us, it is good that outlives us. And the same principle applies to the possessions that bring more evil than good to us. But this principle is not just for material possessions, it also relates to our relations with those close to us, our family, close friends, and colleagues. Johnson, while remembering the death of his closed ones, notes, quote open, with regard to the sharpest and most melting sorrow, that which arises from the loss of those whom we have loved with tenderness, it may be observed that friendship between mortals can be contracted on no other terms than that one must sometime mourn for the other's death. And this grief will always yield to the survivor one consolation proportionate to his affliction. For the pain, whatever it be that he himself feels, his friend has escaped. Quote close. The best remedy for the grief of our closest friend is the thought that at least he or she escaped this same grief. Aristotle said that there are three kinds of friendships. The first kind and the least lasting of all is the one when two people become friends to derive pleasure from each other. This is the friendship with the objective of attaining pleasure from the other. The second kind of friendship is the one when two people become friends with the purpose of deriving utility from the other. This is the friendship common amongst businessmen, friendship with the objective of deriving utility from the other. And the last kind and the most noble is the one where you are friend with the other with the objective of achieving the best for the other. The last kind of friendship is the death of ego. But another danger lurks in the future, which Johnson has explained here. We become so attached that we forget that the other person could die. In fact, we run away from this thought. But even here, death seems merciful. Because imagine what would have happened if you would not have been there and your best friend would be mourning and in tears. After having addressed death as remedy for desire and grief, now Johnson comes to death as remedy of fear. He addresses it thus, quote open, nor is fear the most overbearing and resistless of all our passions, less to be temperated by this universal medicine of the mind. The frequent contemplation of death as it shews the vanity of all human good, discovers likewise the lightness of all terrestrial evil, which certainly can last no longer than the subject upon which it acts. And according to the old observation, must be shorter, as it is more violent. The most cruel calamity which misfortune can produce must, by the necessity of nature, be quickly at an end. The soul cannot long be held in prison, but will fly away and leave a lifeless body to human malice. Quote close. Radit ki sui ludibria trunci, and soaring mocks the broken frame below. The crueler the calamity, the quicker it would end. There may be no moral world order, but there certainly is a natural order to deal with cruelty, and it is death. The Pharaoh killed hundreds and thousands of babies because he thought himself immortal. But in the end, he died suffocating in the same sea, which exploded to make way for the very same Moses for whom he killed these babies. And when Moses had crossed the sea, it came crashing down on him. It is true, as Johnson exclaims, that we are least fearful of death when faced with an immediate fear. Because any fear has at the end of it the fear of death in some form. Rather than fearing everything, our minds should focus on nothing but death. Accept it as a reality and let no fear nor even of death to intervene in the calmness of our moral lives. People change their moral principles for fear of death. People even change their religion for fear of death. Yes, that's true as well. But Johnson is not finished yet with his explanation that is about to come to this precise point. Quote open. The utmost that we can threaten to one another is that death which indeed we may precipitate but cannot retard, and from which therefore it cannot seem a wise man to buy a reprieve at the expense of virtue, since he knows not how small a portion of time he can purchase, but knows that whether short or long, it will be made less valuable by the remembrance of the price at which it has been obtained. He is sure that he destroys his happiness, but is not sure that he lengthens his life. Quote close. These people who go about spreading fear of death think that they can put an end to their principles. Hussein stood for his principles in Karbala and accepted death with faith. And today he lives while Yazid mourns. As Johnson here elucidates that all the person intending to kill the other is doing is hastening others' happiness, because though in his eyes he has destroyed, but in the world's eyes he has increased the value of others' principles. Nonetheless, this act is futile because death awaits the killer as much as he wanted to hasten the mortality of the other. It does not matter whether one dies at 20 or 80, as Sartre said. What he actually said was that it is as absurd to die at 20 as at 80. What we forget often is what is in store for us as the result of our actions. We envy after others, consider them rivals, and yet unknowingly we have actually become our own worst enemy. Death has not opened our eyes yet. We have not yet sat down and reflected upon the fact that nobody is here to live forever. And at the same time, nobody will be immune to the judgment of history once the act is over. We need to limit our designs in accordance with our mortality. All these violent desires that Johnson has talked about until now are the result of nothing but our habitual forgetfulness of mortality. But it is not an advice just for the things, it is also an advice for us readers. The commoner who works hard daily, but sometimes to get into the trap of purposelessly elongating our desires into the future that our mortality would not allow. He provides this lesson that must be written in gold in our rooms. Quote open. The known shortness of life as it ought to moderate our passions may likewise with equal propriety contract our designs. There is not time for the most forcible genius and most active industry to extend its effects beyond a certain sphere. To protect the conquest of the world is the madness of mighty princes. To hope for excellence in every science has been the folly of literary heroes, and both have found at last that they have panted for a height of eminence denied to humanity, and have lost many opportunities for making themselves useful and happy, by a vain ambition of obtaining a species of honor which the eternal laws of providence have placed beyond the reach of man. Quote close. We need to humble ourselves in face of the eternal laws of providence. We need to accept the fact that there are more things out of our control than under it. We need to learn from the stupidities of the kings that have stood over the mountains and erected forts in uninhabitable places, and yet they lie in their graves unheard of with moths all over their corpse. Johnson has given us a tinge in our spine, and yet he has to offer the final judgment on the kings. That he writes thus. Quote open. The miscarriages of the great designs of princes are recorded in the histories of the world, but are of little use to the bulk of mankind, who seem very little interested in admonitions against errors which they cannot commit. But the fate of learned ambition is a proper subject for every scholar to consider. For who has not had occasion to regret the dissipation of great abilities in the boundless multiplicity of pursuits? To lament the sudden desertion of excellent designs upon the offer of some other subject made inviting by its novelty, and to observe the inaccuracy and deficiencies of works left unfinished by too great an extension of the plan. Quote close. All of us have had this experience, and we have talked about it in detail earlier in this video. I just want to add here before I conclude that all we need in our homes is a collection of Johnson's essays and read one each day. And then not a month would have hardly passed and the world would start to appear very different to us. Not that the world has changed, but we would have upended our perspective, and that also only for our own betterment. This is how the sage concludes, almost speaking to himself, that one day, dear friend, you will also die. Quote open. It is always pleasing to observe how much more our minds can conceive than our bodies can perform. Yet it is our duty while we continue in this complicated state to regulate one part of our composition by some regard to the other. We are not to indulge our corporeal appetites with pleasures that impair our intellectual vigor, nor gratify our minds with schemes which we know our lives must fail in attempting to execute. The uncertainty of our duration ought at once to set bounds to our designs and add incitements to our industry. And when we find ourselves inclined either to immensity in our schemes or sluggishness in our endeavors, we may either check or animate ourselves by recollecting with the father of physic that art is long and life is short. Quote close. Thank you, everyone.